By the time cameras existed, many species were already disappearing. Extinction moved quietly while the world looked elsewhere. A few final photographs were taken. The last evidence these animals ever lived. Some images show creatures that look healthy, unaware they are the end of their bloodline. Others show animals so isolated and worn down that the moment feels like a final surrender. These photos are not just records, they are endings. Each one captures a life that should have continued, a species that should still be here, and the exact moment we failed to notice what was being lost forever. Let's begin with a creature that died alone in a cold zoo, forgotten and unnamed. When the last quagga died at Amsterdam Zoo in 1883, staff simply requested another be captured from the wild. But the horrifying truth was that the last wild one had been killed 5 years earlier, and nobody had even noticed. The quagga looked like someone started painting stripes on a horse but quit halfway, with bold markings on its front half fading to solid brown on the back. This wasn't a hybrid, but a distinct zebra subspecies living only in South Africa's grasslands. Dutch and British settlers found huge herds and assumed the supply was endless. With hunting for meat and hides exploding in the mid-1800s, farmers killed them to clear grazing land for livestock. The last wild quagga was shot around 1878, but because a few lived in European zoos, nobody panicked. When the final captive, a female at Amsterdam Zoo, died on August 12, 1883, the zoo confidently requested another specimen from Africa. Only then did they discover the species had already vanished while the world wasn't paying attention. The last kawo was recorded singing a mating call in 1987, and when you listen to that recording, you hear a male desperately calling for a female that would never answer because she was already dead. And that lonely, unanswered singing is one of the most heartbreaking audio documents of extinction ever captured. The kawo was a Hawaiian honeycreeper, a family of birds that evolved into dozens of specialized species across the Hawaiian Islands. These medium-sized blackbirds with yellow thigh feathers lived in Kauai's forests, feeding primarily on nectar and playing important pollination roles. But European colonizers brought catastrophic changes. Introduced mosquitoes carried avian malaria and pox, diseases native birds had no immunity against. The introduced rats ate eggs and chicks. One by one, different species disappeared from different islands. In 1987, ornithologist David Boynton recorded what was believed to be the last male calling persistently from the forest. This massive fish with a sword-like snout could grow over 20 feet long. It survived since the dinosaur age, but the last one seen alive was injured by a boat in 2003. And when scientists tried tracking it, they lost the signal and never found another. The Yangtze paddlefish was one of Earth's largest freshwater fish, with some reaching 23 feet and weighing over 1,000 pounds. Its elongated paddle-shaped rostrum was packed with electroreceptors that detected prey fish in murky water. These ancient fish had existed for 200 million years, surviving multiple mass extinctions. But overfishing, habitat loss, and dams blocking spawning migrations devastated them. In January 2003, Chinese scientists captured an injured female, implanted a tracking device, and released her. The signal was lost almost immediately. Despite extensive searches, no one has seen a Yangtze paddlefish since. Scientists actually brought this mountain goat back from extinction through cloning, but the resurrected baby lived only 7 minutes before her lungs failed, making the Pyrenean ibex the only animal to go extinct twice. This subspecies of Spanish ibex lived exclusively in the Pyrenees Mountains, with males sporting impressive 30-inch curved horns. They thrived in steep, rocky terrain where predators couldn't follow, but hunting and competition from livestock gradually reduced their numbers. By the 1980s, only a small population remained in Spain's Ordesa National Park, and despite protection, they continued declining from inbreeding and disease. The last known individual, a female named Celia, was found dead on January 6, 2000, killed by a falling tree. Scientists had collected her tissue samples, and in 2003, they cloned a female kid using a domestic goat surrogate. The clone was born alive, but died within minutes from lung defects. Pinta Island tortoise once inhabited most of the Galapagos Islands, with each island developing distinct subspecies. They lived peacefully for centuries until whalers discovered that giant tortoises could survive months without food or water, making them perfect living food storage for long voyages. Sailors loaded hundreds onto ships. By the early 1900s, scientists assumed they were extinct. Then, in 1971, a scientist spotted a single male on Pinta Island. Named Lonesome George, he was moved to a research station where scientists spent 41 years trying to save his genetic line by introducing females from related subspecies. George showed little interest, and the few eggs produced never developed. On June 24, 2012, his caretaker found him dead, ending a subspecies that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years. This striped marsupial, known as the Tasmanian tiger, wasn't related to tigers at all, but it was hunted like one across Tasmania's forests. It raised its young in a pouch, but hunted small animals to survive. On mainland Australia, thylacines vanished about 3,000 years ago after dingoes arrived. In Tasmania, they survived longer. When sheep farmers started losing livestock, they blamed the thylacine, though feral dogs were the real culprits. The government offered bounties for any kill, £1 per adult, 10 shillings per pup. Between 1888 and 1909, hunters claimed payment for 2,180 kills. By 1936, only one remained, a female at Hobart Zoo. On September 7, 1936, someone forgot to let her into her sleeping quarters. She died that night from a cold. The final photograph shows her lean frame and exhausted eyes, a reminder that extinction sometimes happens because of simple negligence and one careless mistake. Passenger pigeons once numbered 5 billion. Their flocks were so massive they darkened the sky for hours, but humans killed every single one in less than a century. They were the most abundant bird in North America, possibly the world. But settlers saw unlimited meat, and commercial hunters used nets, guns, and dynamite to harvest entire flocks for city markets. The birds needed massive colonies to breed successfully, and once their numbers dropped, reproduction collapsed. By 1900, none remained in the wild. The last one, Martha, pictured here, died at the Cincinnati Zoo in September 1914. Her body was frozen in ice and shipped to the Smithsonian. These flightless seabirds, known as great auks, stood 30 inches tall and looked like penguins, but lived in the North Atlantic. They were clumsy on land, but graceful underwater, diving deep to catch fish. For thousands of years they thrived, but their inability to fly made them easy prey for hunters wanting meat, feathers, and fat. By the early 1800s, they'd become so rare that museums started offering rewards for specimens, which only accelerated the killing. On July 3, 1844, 3 fishermen landed on Eldey Island off Iceland and found the last breeding pair with their egg. They strangled both birds and smashed the egg because it was cracked and worthless to collectors. The men split about $100, and that was that. Carolina parakeets were North America's only native parrot, traveling in loud flocks across forests from the Great Plains to the Atlantic. They ate cocklebur seeds, which are deadly poisonous, and the toxin accumulated in their bodies, killing any predator that tried eating them. But in the late 1800s, the fashion industry discovered their feathers made stunning hat decorations, and commercial hunters began targeting them aggressively. Farmers also shot them by the thousands for raiding crops. The strangest part is how fast they vanished. Healthy breeding populations existed until 1904. They'd almost completely disappeared. The last one, a male named Incas, died in 1918 at Cincinnati Zoo, the same place Martha the passenger pigeon had died 4 years earlier. This magnificent bird was America's largest woodpecker, measuring 20 inches long with a wingspan of 30 inches and an ivory bill that looked almost too big for its head. They are called the ivory-billed woodpecker and needed vast old-growth forests because they fed on beetle larvae under the bark of recently dead trees, requiring at least 3 square miles per breeding pair. When logging companies clear-cut southeastern forests in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the woodpecker's habitat vanished. By the 1920s, only scattered populations remained in remote swamps. Ornithologist James Tanner photographed and filmed a small group in Louisiana's Singer Tract during the 1930s, creating the last confirmed images. These pale, nearly blind freshwater dolphins, known as Baiji River dolphin, had lived in China's Yangtze River for over 20 million years, navigating murky water using sophisticated echolocation. They had long, narrow beaks, small, useless eyes, and ghostly light gray skin. Chinese culture revered them as sacred for thousands of years. But 20th century industrialization transformed the Yangtze into one of the busiest shipping channels on Earth. Massive cargo ships created underwater noise that interfered with the dolphins' echolocation, essentially making them deaf and blind. Fishing lines killed dolphins indiscriminately, and pollution poisoned the water. In 1979, China declared them protected, but enforcement was weak. The last confirmed sighting occurred in 2002. In 2006, an international team conducted an intensive 6-week survey using boats, observers, and underwater acoustic equipment covering the entire navigable river. They found nothing. The Baiji became the first dolphin species driven to extinction by humans. Japanese sea lions were large marine mammals living along the coasts of Japan, Korea, and Russia, with males reaching 8 feet and over 1,000 pounds. They had distinctive manes of coarse hair that gave them a lion-like appearance. For centuries, they coexisted with fishing communities, but in the late 1800s, commercial hunting targeted them intensively for skins, oil, and internal organs valuable in Asian medicine. Fishermen also blamed them for depleting fish stocks, though human overfishing was the real problem. The population collapsed rapidly, and by the 1930s, they'd become extremely rare. The last confirmed sighting in Japanese waters occurred in the 1970s. Steller's sea cows were enormous marine mammals related to dugongs and manatees, with thick bark-like skin and paddle-shaped tails. They lived exclusively around the Commander Islands in the Bering Sea, floating peacefully in kelp forests. German naturalist Georg Steller first described them in 1741 after his ship wrecked on Bering Island. He observed them living in family groups, showing affection and apparently mourning when members were killed. Unfortunately, his expedition revealed to Russian fur hunters that the islands were rich in valuable sea otters and fur seals, and those hunting parties needed food. Steller's sea cows were perfect targets because they measured 30 feet long and weighed 10 tons, were slow, couldn't dive, and were completely unafraid of humans. Hunters would spear one and let it tire while the herd crowded around trying to help, making it easy to kill multiple animals. By 1768, just 27 years after discovery, they were completely extinct. The golden toad was a small amphibian living in just 4 square miles of Costa Rica's Monteverde cloud forest, with males sporting fluorescent orange coloration that made them look like tiny jewels. They spent most of the year underground, emerging only during the brief rainy season to breed in temporary pools. Scientists didn't discover them until 1964. In May 1987, herpetologist Martha Crump documented over 1,500 individuals at breeding pools. But 1987 turned out unusually dry, and many pools dried up before tadpoles could develop. When researchers returned in 1989, only a single male was observed, calling persistently where no females appeared. The species was declared extinct in 2004, killed by drought and chytrid fungus that thickens amphibian skin and prevents oxygen absorption. The movie Rio was about finding the last male a mate, but in reality, the last wild Spix's macaw was so lonely that he spent years flying with a completely different species of parrot because he had no one else. Spix's macaws were stunning blue parrots native to a small region of northeastern Brazil, living in gallery forests along seasonal creeks. They were never abundant, with their entire range covering only a few hundred square miles. But 20th century wildlife trafficking devastated the population as collectors sought these rare parrots for private collections and the pet trade. In 1990, researchers confirmed only a single male survived, observed flying and feeding with Illiger's macaws, a different species. Conservationists released a captive female to bond with him, but she disappeared within weeks, likely killed by a predator. The lonely male continued being observed until October 2000, when he vanished. The Formosan clouded leopard lived exclusively on Taiwan, inhabiting dense mountain forests where thick vegetation provided ambush hunting cover. These medium-sized cats had distinctive cloud-shaped markings, long tails for balance, and proportionally the longest canine teeth relative to body size of any living cat. They were perfectly adapted for tree life, using flexible ankle joints to navigate the canopy. But when commercial logging cleared Taiwan's old-growth forests in the early 20th century, the habitat rapidly disappeared. Hunters also targeted them for pelts and bones used in traditional medicine. The last confirmed sighting by scientists occurred in 1983, and despite camera traps, genetic sampling, and interviews with local hunters, no evidence of survivors has been found. It was once so common that servants begged not to eat it again, yet in the end, the entire species collapsed around one lonely survivor known as Booming Ben. The heath hen filled America's eastern grasslands from Virginia to Maine, booming across the landscape every spring. But hunting, farming, and predators forced the entire species onto one island by the 1870s. A reserve formed in 1908 briefly saved them, growing the flock to about 2,000. Then fire, disease, harsh winters, and hawks wiped them out in a brutal sequence. By 1928, only Ben remained. He vanished on March 11, 1932. The last 5 were all males, meaning the species was already doomed before anyone admitted it. This tiny black and brown sparrow, known as the Dusky seaside sparrow, lived only in Florida's coastal marshes, a world erased by mosquito control flooding and the spread of development. By 1968, roughly 900 remained. By 1980, only 5, every one of them male. Scientists captured them, hoping crossbreeding could at least preserve their DNA. But the plan failed. The last pure bird, orange-banded, died on June 17, 1987, cradled in a researcher's hands. For thousands of years, this tiny bird survived storms and predators. What it could not survive was human. Saudi gazelles were medium-sized antelopes living in Arabian deserts and rocky foothills, with tan coats, white undersides, and short curved horns. They were perfectly adapted to extreme desert conditions, extracting moisture from vegetation. But in the 20th century, automobiles and high-powered rifles made hunting easy, and wealthy hunters pursued them as sport. Habitat degradation from overgrazing added pressure. By the 1970s, they'd become extremely rare, and by the 1980s, no wild populations remained. A small captive group survived at Riyadh Zoo and private collections. But in the early 2000s, disease swept through the captive population, and the last confirmed Saudi gazelle died in 2008. The western black rhino once roamed across Cameroon, Chad, and the Central African Republic, browsing shrubs with its hooked upper lip. In the mid-20th century, they numbered around 850,000. But by 1995, relentless poaching dropped that to about 2,400 as criminal syndicates killed rhinos at an industrial scale, supplying Asian markets where powdered horn was falsely believed to be medicinal. By 2000, only 10 remained. In 2001, researchers found one lonely survivor, and then it vanished. No confirmed western black rhino was ever seen again. The IUCN declared the subspecies extinct in 2011. The Bramble Cay melomys was a rat-sized rodent that lived on a coral island barely 1,000 feet long near the Great Barrier Reef. This was literally the entire species range, one of the smallest of any mammal on Earth. The melomys fed on vegetation and turtle eggs, sheltering in burrows. For thousands of years, this worked fine despite the island being barely above sea level. Rising seas and stronger storms repeatedly flooded the island, destroying vegetation and drowning the animals. Fishermen still saw them in 2009, but by 2014, surveys found none. In 2016, the species was declared extinct. This small diving bird lived on just one lake in Madagascar and survived there peacefully for thousands of years. But when people introduced carnivorous fish that ate the grebe's food and aggressive plants that tangled their wings, the bird simply disappeared within a single human lifetime. The Alaotra grebe was found exclusively on Lake Alaotra in central Madagascar, the island's largest lake, covering about 30,000 acres. They fed on small fish and aquatic invertebrates. For millennia, they lived in stability, but in the 20th century, humans introduced snakehead fish that competed for food and may have eaten chicks. People also introduced water hyacinth, forming dense floating mats. Grebes became entangled in these mats, and their reduced wings made escape difficult. Nylon fishing nets also trapped and drowned many. By the 1980s, the population had declined dramatically. The last confirmed sighting occurred in 2009, and extensive 2010 surveys found no survivors. The species was declared extinct in 2010. The Xerces blue was a small butterfly with a 1-inch wingspan, notable for its male's striking silvery blue wings that shimmered in sunlight. The females were brown with orange markings. This butterfly lived only on coastal dunes around the San Francisco Peninsula, with caterpillars feeding exclusively on native lupine plants in sandy soil. For thousands of years, the dunes remained relatively undisturbed. But starting in the mid-1800s and accelerating in the early 1900s, San Francisco expanded rapidly, and developers viewed dunes as perfect locations for housing. Dunes were flattened, lupines destroyed, and within decades, the butterfly's entire habitat was eliminated. The last confirmed sighting occurred around the 1940s, with the exact date lost to history. By the 1950s, extensive searches found no Xerces blues. This was the first North American insect confirmed extinct from urbanization, inspiring the creation of the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. This brilliantly colored Australian parrot with turquoise, red, and yellow feathers was so rare by the 1920s that ornithologists actually celebrated when they found a single nest, but that nest turned out to be one of the last, and by 1928, the paradise parrot had vanished completely. Paradise parrots were small, ground-feeding parrots native to eastern Australia's grasslands. Males displayed spectacular plumage with bright green backs, turquoise faces, scarlet shoulders, and long tail feathers, making them one of Australia's most beautiful birds. These parrots had unusual nesting behavior, excavating burrows in termite mounds rather than tree cavities. They fed primarily on grass seeds, particularly certain native species. European colonization brought massive grassland changes, with settlers clearing land for agriculture and introducing livestock that grazed intensively. African grasses began replacing the native grasses that the parrots depended on. By the 1880s, they were already scarce. In 1922, ornithologist Cyril Gerard discovered a nest and photographed the pair feeding chicks, creating the only footage of living paradise parrots ever taken. Barbary lions were the largest lion subspecies, with males weighing up to 500 pounds and sporting enormous dark manes extending from heads down across chests and bellies, an adaptation to cold mountain nights in their Atlas mountain habitat. Unlike modern African lions living in hot savannas, Barbary lions inhabited cooler forests and mountains across North Africa from Morocco to Egypt. For thousands of years, they occupied a unique place in human culture, featuring in ancient Egyptian, Roman, and Islamic art. Romans captured them for gladiatorial combat. But as firearms became common and North African countries modernized in the 1800s, killing a Barbary lion became a status symbol for wealthy trophy hunters. The absolute last confirmed sighting occurred in 1957 in Morocco's High Atlas Mountains. Java tigers were a distinct subspecies that evolved on the Indonesian island of Java, adapted to tropical rainforests where they hunted wild pigs, deer, and smaller mammals. They were smaller and darker than other tigers, with males weighing around 220 to 310 pounds compared to the 400 to 600 pounds typical of mainland Asian tigers. For thousands of years, they coexisted with relatively small human populations, occupying mainly coastal areas, leaving interior forests as tiger habitat. But in the 20th century, Java's human population exploded, growing from about 5 million in 1815 to over 60 million by 1975. This boom required converting vast forest areas into farmland, and tigers found their habitat disappearing at an exponential rate. Conflict with humans increased as tigers occasionally killed livestock, leading to retaliatory killings and organized hunts. The last confirmed sighting occurred in 1979 at Meru Batiri National Park. The species was declared extinct in 2003. The Christmas Island pipistrelle was a small insectivorous bat weighing only about 1/10 of an ounce, one of the smallest mammals on Earth. It lived exclusively on Christmas Island, an Australian territory in the Indian Ocean, hunting insects through the forest using echolocation. For most of its history, the population remained stable, with thousands roosting in caves and tree hollows. But starting in the 1980s, researchers noticed declines, though the exact cause remained unclear. Possible factors included introduced predators like cats and rats, introduced competitors like Asian house geckos eating similar insects, parasites, and disease. The decline accelerated dramatically in the 2000s. By 2009, acoustic monitoring detected only a single bat's calls. Conservationists attempted to capture it for breeding, but the tiny bat proved impossible to locate visually. In August 2009, the acoustic monitors stopped detecting calls. Searches continued for months, but no Christmas Island pipistrelle was ever found again. This frog had evolved one of the most bizarre reproductive strategies in the entire animal kingdom, but humans barely had time to study this incredible strategy before the entire species disappeared. The Conondale gastric brooding frog was discovered in 1984 in southeastern Queensland's mountains. It was about 2 inches long with mottled brown coloring for camouflage. But what made it extraordinary was its reproduction. After external fertilization, the female would swallow the eggs, which developed in her stomach. The eggs secreted a substance that shut down stomach acid production, turning the stomach into a temporary uterus. Developing tadpoles lived there for about 6 weeks, while the mother couldn't eat at all. When development was complete, she'd vomit or birth fully formed froglets. This incredibly rare method, called gastric brooding, was known in only 2 frog species worldwide, both in Australia. Scientists were excited to study this, but the Conondale gastric brooding frog was last seen in 1984 in the wild and 1983 in captivity, with the captive individual dying before researchers could establish a breeding program. The Laysan rail, a tiny flightless bird weighing about 2 ounces, lived on Laysan Island, Hawaii. It thrived for thousands of years until introduced rabbits devastated the vegetation. Conservationists translocated some rails to Midway Atoll, establishing a backup population. Both populations recovered, but in 1943, rats accidentally introduced during World War II decimated the birds. Within months, every rail on both islands was gone. The last confirmed Laysan rail died around 1944. Early photographs show delicate birds that looked defenseless, illustrating how quickly island species succumbed to introduced predators, despite human conservation efforts. The smooth handfish was a small fish, growing to about 4 inches long, belonging to a family that had evolved modified pectoral fins that looked and functioned remarkably like hands, allowing them to literally walk across the seafloor rather than swim. This species was known only from waters around Tasmania, specifically near Hobart. The problem is that only 4 specimens were ever collected, all between 1802 and 1804 during early European exploration. Those 4 preserved specimens in museums represented the entire scientific understanding of the species. For over 200 years, no one reported seeing a smooth handfish. In the 2000s, researchers began systematic surveys of Tasmanian coastal waters looking for handfish species, several of which were critically endangered. They found a few other handfish species, but never the smooth handfish. In 2020, after analyzing historical data, conducting extensive surveys, and finding absolutely no evidence that they still existed, the IUCN declared them extinct. Every single extinction here happened either directly or indirectly because of human actions, from overhunting to habitat destruction to introduced species brought along without thinking. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.